If you could only have 5 bottles of whiskey, which 5 bottles would you have? Well, I'm Phil, welcome to First Phil, and I'm gonna fill you in about those 5 whiskies. So Shayla from the Whisky Central called me out actually quite a few months ago now, and it's taken me this long to kind of finally make the video, but she called me out about making a video for my top 5 scotches.
But I'm hoping some Scotch channels will join in and try to beat my list. I'm talking to you, First Phil Whiskey.
And a bunch of different channels kind of categorize this in different ways, and there's one way that I saw it categorized that I thought would be really interesting for you guys to know what I'd pick. And they are the Daily Drinker, the go-to dram. It's not actually Daily Drinker, it's more a go-to dram, and I really want to encourage people drinking every day. Secondly, the Impress a Guest whiskey. This is the whiskey I sort of imagine someone coming to your house who already knows a little bit about whiskey, and you get that bottle out and they go, nice. And then the third category is the mixer. And the fourth category is the Friday night port. And the fifth category is the special occasion whiskey. Beauty. So let's jump into it. First of all, the go-to dram. So my go-to whiskey is gonna be the Glencairn 10. I know I've already kind of banged on about this whiskey heaps on my channel, but look, if I had a list, if I could only choose 5 whiskies and I needed a good go-to whiskey, I'll be honest, it's gonna be the Glencairn 10. It gets everything right, it's unchill filter, natural color, bottled at 46%. But beyond that, the smell and taste is incredible. It's not relying on being a sherry bomb, being a smoke bomb. The spirit has to be good, and this is great spirit. Yeah, so it's just that mixture of those really nice white fruit, there's like lemon tart, bread. It's just a really delicious whiskey. And if you want to go into more depth about the Glencairn 10, go watch my review of this bottle. But great dram, and definitely my go-to whiskey. Now I know because this is such a good value whiskey, it's becoming harder and harder to find, especially from some of the comments from my review of this video, that some of you in some markets can't even find this whiskey, or it's becoming quite expensive, especially from the global situation at the moment and the lead up to Christmas. So for all these picks off this list, I'm gonna give you a runner-up, a backup whiskey if you can't find this one. And my backup for this whiskey is the Deanston 12. Yeah, so the Deanston 12, and as I said before, I like dry whiskies. Both of these are pretty dry whiskies, meaning that they're not that sweet. It's also ex-bourbon cask, and it gets all those integrity stats, unchill filter, natural color, bottled above 46%, and an age statement, all those things. Great, fantastic, go-to whiskey. And now for the next category, which is the Impress a Guest. So the whiskey I've chosen for the Impress a Guest category is the Octomore. And look, pretty much any Octomore will work for this. This whiskey is not about it being good value. It's not good value, it's pretty expensive for what it is. And it's not about it being approachable, but the stats are impressive. So first of all, this is cask strength. This is bottled at 59.5%. And secondly, as an age statement of 5 years, but if you've watched my Lafroig 10 versus Lafroig 28 video, you'll know that actually younger peatier whiskey is more smoky. So this is going to be a smoke bomb, which leads us to the ppm, which means the sort of parts of peat per million. It's basically this sort of indicator about how smoky a whiskey is. So for context, the Lafroig 10, a really famous smoky Islay whiskey, is 45 ppm. So yeah, pretty high. That's a smoky whiskey. And then the Port Charlotte 10, another very smoky Islay whiskey, also from the Brodick Lady Distillery. This one is 40 ppm, which, yeah, it's a smoky dram. So what's the Octomore? This Octomore, well, the bottle I've got, there's different batches, so they're all slightly different. But this one is 208 ppm. So it's one of those ones that you can pour your whiskey loving mates and have a great banter over. Whether they like it or not, it's interesting. It's an interesting, fun whiskey. Wow. It's just, there's the smoke, right? There's the peat bomb. It's maritime kind of smoke. There's tar, but there's this really nice kind of behind that smoke, really nice sort of like a pork crackling, There's some like aged cheddar, some peppermint. Yeah, so this is an impressive whiskey. It makes a statement. But what is the runner-up to this whiskey? What is the other whiskey I would use to impress a guest? So this is my runner-up, my other whiskey I would use to impress a guest. And so this whiskey is an independent bottling, Signatory Vintage, which is a great independent bottler. And if you don't know much about independent bottlers, go watch my video about independent bottlers. Basically what they do is they buy casks directly from the distillery and they can kind of bottle it how they like. These guys have bottled this specific whiskey very impressively. So this bottle is the Bunnahabhain 11. So basically what they've done is they've bought a cask from Bunnahabhain that was about 11 years old and they've bottled it under Signatory Vintage. But that's not the impressive part. The impressive part is that this whiskey is part of their cask strength collection. But this is no ordinary cask strength whiskey. This is the most powerful cask strength whiskey I've ever owned. This whiskey is 68.2% ABV. Look, if the Octomore was the nuclear bomb of smoky peaty whiskey and Scotch, this is the nuclear bomb of sherried whiskey because it's aged only in first fill sherry barrel. And what I'm interested to know in the comments is if any of you have had a whiskey that's more powerful than this. Have you ever had a whiskey that's above 68.2%? But look, without going into too much detail about this whiskey and making this video far too long, I've actually done a full review of this whiskey on my Patreon page. So if you're interested in extra content that I make, go over to Patreon. Why not jump on board? So let's jump into the next category, and that is the mixer. This whiskey needs to do three things really well. And as I've already talked about before, I like to be able to share my whiskey. I think a big part of enjoying whiskey is the ability to share whiskey. But what if they don't like whiskey? Well, the first thing it needs to be able to do well is that this whiskey needs to be the sort of whiskey I can give to someone who normally probably wouldn't really drink whiskey. The second part is it needs to be a great whiskey in cocktails, and all sorts of different types of cocktails, and the highball and the old fashioned and the whiskey sour. And thirdly, this whiskey needs to be very good value. Look, if I have 10 people coming around and I have to make 10 cocktails and then they all want another cocktail after that, I need a whiskey that I can rebuy and not break the bank. So that's why I chose this whiskey. I think it hits all three of those points. But also as well, look, I'm not going to drink that Octomore in summertime. Let's be honest. I'm not going to drink that on a really hot summer's day by the pool. But I often drink cocktails in the summer. This whiskey, it's aged in a Caribbean cask. It's aged in a rum cask. So it adds that little bit of sweetness. It adds some of those nice tropical flavors to this Glenlivet. See, I normally would have chosen the Founder's Reserve, which is also a great whiskey, great for mixing, which I talk about in my 3 ways to drink whiskey. There are lots of ways to drink whiskey, and one of the ways is having it in cocktails. But look, let's be honest, this is not an extremely complex whiskey. But I know for someone who doesn't drink much whiskey, who's still trying to get used to the burn of whiskey, this is going to be a good one. Well, my runner-up whiskey for this category is the Wild Turkey 101. So my runner-up is the Wild Turkey 101, and I think this whiskey works really well in multiple different ways. This is the sort of whiskey that is so versatile. If people came around to the house, and if some people who liked whiskey, I could give it to them neat, and if some people wanted a cocktail, I could put it in a cocktail, and it will do really well. Because of that high strength, it will cut through the Friday night pour. And what I've got to say about this, my Friday nights are pretty quiet. You know, we've got a baby, and look, what I'm saying is this is not a whiskey for you're going down the town and let's have a few drinks before going in town. That's not that. This is a whiskey that's for, it's been a long week's worth of work and you want to treat yourself. You want a whiskey that's slightly better than normal. So the whiskey I've chosen is the Kilchoman Lochgorm, and this fits the category perfectly. So a little bit of background about Kilchoman. They're kind of the new kid on the block on Islay. They're one of the newer distilleries, and every year they've been releasing a new version of the Lochgorm, and it's aged solely in Oloroso sherry butts, and it's bottled at 46%. It's unchill filtered, it's natural color, and also, see, this is why age statement is the bonus point for me. I actually don't think it's as important as the other points. And because sometimes blenders want to mix up young spirit to add some of those kind of hot spirit notes to a whiskey. So it gives them that flexibility. So I don't always think age statement is absolutely necessary. And so Kilchoman doesn't normally have age statements. However, they've started telling you what the minimum age is. This one says it's matured for a minimum of 9 years. So it's a 9-year-old. With Kilchoman, I tried a few bottles of theirs about 5 years ago, and back then, yeah, I thought it was good whiskey. I didn't think it was the best style of whiskey, but I didn't think it was bad whiskey. But the fault of mine is that I kind of put this whiskey aside and I kind of forgot about this distillery. And look, for the longest time when I had really written the script a few months ago, I had the Aaron 18 in this category. This was my Friday night dram. But after seeing a really glowing review from G Whiskey about his glowing review of this bottle, and then getting a dram from Nick Keane, I went out and bought a bottle myself. And I found myself, when I wanted to treat myself, going to this bottle even over this one, which I couldn't really believe was happening. Because what Kilchoman has become really known for in recent times is how well they integrate peat with sherry. They get those beautiful sherry notes and blending it together with those really nice barbecue maritime peat notes. When you think of a sherried peaty whiskey from Islay, I think the whiskey most people think of is the Lagavulin 16. And Lagavulin 16 is a fantastic whiskey. It was one of the whiskies that got me into whiskey. And I know for a lot of you, it's one of the whiskies that got you into whiskey. But the thing is, sometimes it can be a little tame at 43%. And sometimes it can feel a little weak, especially for the whiskey lover, the whiskey geek, the person who really wants to get as much out of their whiskey as possible. And also it's coloured, it's chill filtered and all that sort of thing. If you want an integrity bottling version of a Lagavulin 16, my view is this is it. So I'm really glad that attention has been brought back to Kilchoman and that people like G Whiskey are starting to highlight how good this whiskey is. And I agree, this is a great whiskey. So let's try some. It's just such a nice blend of really dark berry notes, those chocolatey notes, those caramel notes, and then that really nice barbecue notes, like a brisket, like a barbecue marinade. So what is my runner-up for this category? A whiskey that I think is better than most of my whiskeys, a really good Friday night special treat dram. Well, I've already talked about it. It's the Aaron 18. Fantastic whiskey, really rich whiskey. And the next category, the pinnacle of this list, the special occasion whiskey. So my special occasion whiskey is the Aaron 23, and I think what makes a good special occasion whiskey is a special release whiskey. This is a special release from the Aaron distillery, and this is volume 4 of those special releases, and this one's called the Drumden Point, and so each bottle was based after like kind of a scenic place on the Isle of Arran. This one has like a golf course on it. And what's really interesting about this whiskey is that it's 23 years old and it's been solely matured in sherry puncheons, which is kind of like a sherry butt, but it's sort of like squeezed down a bit, sort of more stubby kind of thing. It's bottled above 46%. This one is even more punchy than that. This one's bottled at 49.5%. And for this, because it's a special occasion whiskey, I've brought out my blender's glass because it exaggerates those aromas even more than the Glencairn glass. So let's try some. You're getting that classic Aaron kind of honeyed fruitiness, that toffee apple. And like I talked about in my young versus old whiskey, there's much more complexity in this whiskey. If the Aaron 10 was a 4-piece band, this is the orchestra. Each individual flavour is a bit harder to pick out. There's just a lot more going on from that age. And there's a really nice pastry note with icing sugar, apple pie coming through, some of that spice, those dried fruits, some of that milk chocolate, that tart. It's just a really nice, well-rounded whiskey. What I really like about this whiskey is that it plays both ends of the spectrum. It's really tasty, it's really moorish, it goes down so well, but also it has interest factor. It's an interesting whiskey. It's one of those whiskeys that when you're sort of mid-conversation talking to someone, it interrupts that conversation and it makes you want to start talking about the whiskey, which is what I want in this kind of level of whiskey. But look, this is an expensive whiskey and you might not be able to find this whiskey. So what I'd say for you is, yeah, maybe go for the Aaron 18 if you can't find this one, because this is also a really delicious dram and becoming harder to find too. And I think it would also make a great special occasion whiskey. Maybe if you can try it at a bar or your local kind of whiskey sort of shop or whatever, try that first before you splash out. But this whiskey, I like it. I know some people don't like it as much. I think it's fantastic. I think it's a great dram. And I want to thank my patrons for making this video possible. And if you want extra content, go join me on Patreon. I've also got that review of the Bunhaven 11. It's 68.5% if you want to watch that. Yeah, so consider subscribing over there. But above all, make sure you share and enjoy. Beauty.